Hi, I'm Jill Vaughan. I'm a linguist at the Research Unit for Indigenous Language at the University of Melbourne. And so in this talk, I focus on the Northern Australian region, and in particular the region around the community of Maningrida in Arnhem Land, to consider how changing patterns of localised mobility throughout the region's history have engendered differing interactions with ancestral lands and shaped the local language ecology and led to new kinds of language practices. The data behind this talk has largely been gathered in the last 6 or 7 years, focusing around language documentation efforts, particularly for the Barada language, a non-polyglossic language of the Northern Australian region. This has involved naturalistic speech, recordings of various kinds of multilingual practices across community domains of various kinds, but also language biography interviews, which look at multilingual repertoires, and various forms of collaborative ethnographic work with particularly Barada people in the Maningrida region. But I also draw on historical data from a variety of sources to look at those earlier eras. So earlier anthropological and ethnographic reports, as well as contemporary community accounts that point to some facts about earlier eras. So this research is situated against the backdrop of widespread and pretty devastating language loss across really all of Indigenous Australia. So nowadays there are only about 15 to 20 of an original, say 300 or so distinct languages that are now being learnt as first languages by children. But across the north, it's much more common than elsewhere in Australia for children to still grow up speaking one of these Indigenous languages, or indeed one or more of these Indigenous languages. The last 200 years have also seen the emergence of various kinds of post-colonial contact varieties, which I'll mention a few of later, particularly Kriol. So language and identity in Northern Australia is characterised by an indirect relationship between individuals and languages. So you've got an individual who typically connects through often patrilineal lineage to a clan or a social group like that, and then through to land, a specific tract of territory, and then indirectly to language which is sort of primordially associated with that particular tract of land. And prior to colonisation, we can characterise multilingualism in the region as small scale and non-polyglossic, and also egalitarian. This is probably not something I need to define much given the context of this panel. They're no doubt familiar terms, but by this I mean that there was long-term stable multilingualism, that individual language repertoires were pretty large. There were quite small speaker groups typically, often just a few hundred speakers. And it's supported by a variety of cultural practices, for example, linguistically exogamous marriage. And importantly, languages were not subject to any kind of strict social hierarchy. Another important factor is that there was no widespread lingua franca, really, prior to white contact, and we'll come back to this idea shortly. And so reflexes of this small-scale multilingual system remain robust in some regions in Indigenous Australia, particularly in Arnhem Land, where we're focused today, but are reshaped in various ways by demographic, socio-political shifts and mobilities, as we're going to see. So these connections between language and land, which are underpinned in language ideologies, do have real effects in lived experience and effects on the gravitational orbits of individuals' mobilities, but these connections can also obscure the reality of past patterns of mobility and present patterns of mobility. And research on traditional languages has very often just focused on one particular language at a single point in time. Often these are language documentation efforts. And this contrasts strongly with the reality of language use in the region, which is characterised instead by multilingualism, diverse language repertoires, mobility, and constant evolution and change. So here's a map showing where we're situated. We're in the central northern coast of Northern Australia in Arnhem Land. We're going to be talking particularly about Maningrida, the largest urban community in Arnhem Land, and also the large urban centre of Darwin. Maningrida has a population of about 2,500. It was founded, as we'll hear, in the late 1950s as a welfare settlement. That's distinct from a lot of contemporary Indigenous urban centres, which were often founded as missions. And also important is the fact that culturally and linguistically and socio-politically, Maningrida is sort of a nexus of many distinct groups who traditionally were located further afield in Arnhem Land. Maningrida is highly multilingual, as we're going to see. Individual repertoires are large, only partially overlapping, and there's no shared spoken language that functions as a clear lingua franca. Until 2008, there was a trilingual program at the school, and various scholars have commented that the social need for a spoken lingua franca does not actually seem to exist. So the languages in the region are located along a very important boundary, the boundary between Pama-Nyungan and non-Pama-Nyungan languages. There are over a dozen traditional languages represented in the local language ecology, along with various dialects and sub-varieties. 4 different language families are represented, so quite a great deal of diversity. Also, localized Englishes and contact varieties like Kriol. So Kriol is the grammatically stable English-based Kriol language that's spoken widely across Northern Australia. So prior to the settlement era, mobility was characterised by what we might term sort of circular seasonal mobility for various purposes, such as accessing food, accessing for social reasons, to access other groups, for ceremonies, also for trading relationships over slightly longer distances. Contemporary mobility, very generally, however, is characterised by what's been termed hypermobility, essential to modern living. So much more interaction with large urban centres, as well as with smaller outstation communities and regional hubs, as we'll see. In Indigenous Australia, more generally, this has been termed as a sort of orbiting diaspora between what function as magnet communities. Various ramifications from these changes, including changing interactions with ancestral lands, but also the emergence of new kinds of language practices. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be looking at different stages of Maningrida's history, and I borrow these stages from various scholarly works listed along the top. So we'll start with the pre-colonial era, broadly speaking, prior to 1788. I'll then move on to the protection and preservation era, specifically from Arnhem Land's perspective, looking from the early 20th century to 1957, the founding of Maningrida. Then to the assimilation and integration era from 1957 to 1973. And finally to the most recent era, self-determination and self-management era, which is associated with a whole variety of very important developments in Indigenous Australia and in the region specifically, such as the outstation movement. So in the pre-colonial era, as I've mentioned, mobility was particularly associated with accessing seasonal food sources and ceremony and even conflict, sort of circular and seasonal in some ways. But another really important fact about mobility in that era had to do with contact with fishermen who have been termed Macassans, so from Sulawesi in Indonesia, you can sort of see on the map here on the right, who would travel seasonally to fish for trepang or sea cucumber along the shores of Arnhem Land, Northern Australia. You can see a sea cucumber here on the bottom. And you can see on the right here a depiction in some art of a Macassan prow. And we think that this lasted up to 400 years prior to the 20th century. Even though contact wasn't always friendly between the Macassans and Arnhem Landers, it was deeply significant, and the contact with the Macassans had a deep social impact which resonated really widely through the region. And Macassan symbology has considerable prestige even in contemporary times. So on this fabric produced in the last couple of years by the Bapara Women's Centre in Maningrida, you can see images of Macassan prows. When we think about multilingualism in the pre-colonial era, I've mentioned already that we can depict this as small scale and egalitarian, but we can also pick out the development of a pidgin actually in the local Arnhem Land space between coastal groups and Macassan traders. So this pidgin, which developed, actually became a lingua franca between different local groups who were involved in some way in the trepang processing. And several of these words remain in Arnhem Land languages. For example, the word balanda, which is the commonly used term for white person, which originally comes from the word for Hollander. Here's a fairly simplified schema depicting the largely egalitarian small-scale multilingual ecology of north-central Arnhem Land. So you can see here that languages are depicted as the same size, they're egalitarian, but we also see the Macassan pidgin here with a dotted line intended to distinguish it as a sort of lingua franca of sorts, which operates differently within the ecology to the traditional languages. So moving on to the protection and preservation era, so early 20th century to about 1957. So by the 1950s, the ancestral lands of nearly all the Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory had been annexed by sort of pastoral lease or by the state. And there was a lot of missionary activity and so on. But in 1931, Arnhem Land was declared a reserve. And so Arnhem Landers were largely protected from this and only really had kind of brief encounters with processes like that at the time. And they were able to maintain ownership of their clan estates. Some people attended schools in other communities, such as at Milingimbi and Wadawee that we can see here. And the Second World War was a very important moment in time for Arnhem Land. So there was a military presence in Milingimbi, there was work for rations. People travelled to Darwin and were encouraged to contribute to the war effort, and this facilitated future migrations, which were termed as sort of drift to Darwin. The concomitant multilingualism, well, in some ways, the creation of this reserve contributed to sort of consolidating Arnhem Land as a regional system. Contact with standard English, though, was limited, even though some learnt some English at school elsewhere. And for the first time, Kriol formed part of multilingual repertoires of many who grew up in the era. And so we can see this represented here, the regional system of Arnhem Land now sort of slightly portioned off and distinct from what's beyond, and an increased presence of English and Kriol, albeit still somewhat limited. So the assimilation and integration era, lasting from the foundation of Maningrida in 1957 to about 1973. So Maningrida is established as a rations outpost and a welfare settlement. Following the huge social changes brought about by the Second World War, and the sort of reconfiguration of mobility and settlement patterns, this all caused really significant disruptions to the local language habitat. And one impact was the migration of eastern groups onto Engendered land as the population of the settlement grew significantly. And the multilingualism associated with this meant that there were the arrival of groups such as the Rambaringa, the Barada, the Nakara, Guningo and Gurgoni speakers arrived on the land of the Engendered people and outnumbered them. So Barada speakers now formed the largest group, and smaller language groups now exerted less influence. So we see a bit of a degeneration of that egalitarian relationship between languages. However, there was something of a cultural renaissance. So groups that had been separated following the war were now again in contact. So there was a resurgence in the use of particular traditional languages and also reconnection with traditional socialities and traditional ceremonies. So Maningrida now exists as its own local language ecology, but we also see differing fates, differing power of different language groups within this space, with Barada and Guningo and Yolngu taking on more power as their speaker communities were larger, and other languages falling behind in some ways. We also see the role of Barada and also English and Kriol in the public space. So here's an example from early Maningrida, where Barada is used to direct information to a linguistically diverse group of people who are gathered to hear about new voting rights for Indigenous people. And we can see Barada used with some English and Kriol mixed in as a sort of a lingua franca of sorts in a public setting. So finally, we turn to the self-determination and self-management era. There was a change at the level of the national government, which meant a lot of things, but included the gradual return of local political power to Indigenous groups, the right to education, and the outstation movement, which entailed a shift back to traditional lands, some autonomy from state and capitalist projects. And also the emergence of different kinds of socialities that were constructed away from traditional lands, so around things like work and education and Christianity, and also importantly, Australian rules football. And so these domains followed their own sort of complex trajectories and involved new alliances with outsiders and the learning of new kinds of skills and knowledge. We also see the localization of this sort of orbiting diaspora I mentioned before. So to take the example of the Barada diaspora, it centers around Maningrida, but also includes Darwin, which we can see here on the left, but also includes various outstations associated with Barada traditional lands, and people seasonally move between these three settings in a sort of triangular configuration. The multilingualism associated with this mobility, there are still strong reflexes of small-scale multilingualism which persevere, but these are destabilized in some ways due to the unequal power of different language groups and different roles for languages. So, for example, if we look at the school context, we see that Njebena and Barada have been supported by the school, Barada being the largest speaker community, and Njebena being the language of the land where Maningrida sits. However, other smaller languages such as Nakara or Gurgoni have received less support of this kind, and this has had important ramifications for their fates. We also can see when we look at multilingual repertoires that the language repertoires of speakers of larger languages like Barada tend to be much smaller than those of speakers of smaller languages like Nakara. So Nakara people tend to speak more languages than Barada speakers. We can also note the emergence of new varieties which aren't directly associated with traditional territories. So town-based identities, generational identities, and subcultural identities starting to emerge, and also variation associated with each of these identities. A communalect or lingua franca still doesn't exist. However, we do see the dominance of certain local languages as common L2s, and we see the prevalence of code switching, particularly between Barada and English, as a very common speech style that's lent upon in certain public contexts. Here's an example from a book launch. I won't go through this in detail, but you can pause and have a closer look, and you can see underlined are linguistic features from Barada mixed in with linguistic features from English. This is a very common and somewhat stabilized speech style that's used in public settings, particularly where there's linguistically diverse audience. We can also see sort of what's been termed a digital diglossia, where English is used more so, although not exclusively, in things like texting and social media. Here we can see what that looks like in our sort of simplified schema. Differing power, differing uses for different languages, and the increasing roles as common L2s for Barada English code switching, Yolngu Gunningu, Gunwingu in the Arnhem Land space, and also increasing roles for English and Kriol. Okay, so just to finish up with some final thoughts, we can see from this journey through time and through changing mobilities and multilingualisms that the incorporation of otherness or alterity in small-scale multilingual ecologies and repertoires isn't necessarily a new phenomenon that just comes with colonialism and globalization. So, for example, we can see the incorporation of those Macassan linguistic features and signifiers in Arnhem Land sociology from way back. We also see that the evolution of multilingualism isn't necessarily unidirectional. So it doesn't necessarily go from linguistically diverse and small scale and egalitarian to less diverse and polyglossic in a very simple way. Varied factors along the way can drive intensification or indeed reduction of multilingualism at various points in time. Things like changing patterns of mobility and urbanisation can drive either outcome. And we can see some similarities here to what's been described as superdiversity or diversity within diversity. Here evident not just in Western urban settings, but at the peripheries of globalisation in places like remote Northern Australia. Thank you.